Can everyone see my slides? Is that working?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much, Alex and the team, for the invitation to come back. As Alex said, came to the quantum turn kind of circuitously, and so I'm excited to present this here. The three kind of signs under which I'm working. First is that I understand sovereignty to be the core problematic of international relations. And the thing that makes international relations as a discipline different from others. And just like Latour, I think that Bruno Latour, I think that power is the thing that needs to be explained rather than the thing that does the explaining. And so I'm really concerned with the question of the practice and the experience of sovereignty. Over the past few years, I've also become really interested in pushing a program of decolonization within the discipline. This comes not only from my own experience and my long concern with the colonial and the post-colonial. My first book was about the clash of civilizations and the post-colonial analysis of that work by Samuel Huntington, which for some reason has come back in vogue. And also, the context in which I live and work, which is here on unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Nation. And in Canada, the outcome of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was that there was a duty imposed on secondary and tertiary education to understand the colonial roots of the Canadian state and of the relationship between the Canadian state and colonialism. And so, one of the ways that I really came into this was through reading Bruno Latour's We Have Never Been Modern, where he makes an argument that I'll get into a bit later, but he makes a case for a symmetrical anthropology. And he says that in order to rid ourselves of the tyranny of sunk analytical costs, to break free from false dichotomies between science and political science, between truth and fiction, and between the West and the non-West, we have to be kind of radically open. And I was really sort of inspired at that moment to start connecting the political science of Hobbes and its relation to that sort of Newtonian notion of science. And so that's how I've sort of come to the quantum, but I'm really trying to hold the quantum, juggle is the wrong word, but I'm really trying to hold it in place with that impetus to decolonization. And so my primary project is to ask how we can rethink sovereignty outside of both its Newtonian and its colonial baggage. And I think that that quantum social science has gone a great good distance in thinking about political science and international relations in the quantum vein. And there is a question about, there's a literature about decolonization within the international relations space, but those two conversations are kind of happening in parallel rather than together. And so what I want to do here is demonstrate the way to which I think that superpositionality in particular can really make for some incredible cross-fertilization of those concepts. The danger, and this is a danger that's been pointed out to Latour and to all of us on a number of questions, is that that when engaging with, for example, Indigenous thought or Indigenous experience, then we really need to be mindful about engaging with that thought without reproducing colonial extractivism, except instead of extracting furs or copper or art, we would be extracting ideas. And so I'm really sensitive about my position and the way in which I engage with both the community and the sort of long tradition, in this case of Inuit ideas. So as Alex said, within the field of critical security studies or critical international relations, I think that for me, I want to move away from relationalism or processualism, as much as important as that move has been within critical IR, to look at both entanglement and superpositions as analytical frames. And so I think that the most important question for international relations is sovereignty. And so I want to understand how we can think about sovereignty in superposition. Now, I think that I would take it as accepted ground, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page, the dominant discourse of sovereignty within international relations has traditionally been like the game of Risk, that there is a map of the world and only one person, one army, one sovereign can occupy one territory at a time. And so there is a real sense, despite a host of excellent historians, including my old supervisor, Cal Holste, who demonstrated that colonialism and colonial relations were incredibly heterogeneous and diverse, there is this discussion, particularly within the English school, but other kind of more traditional discourses, that Westphalian European sovereignty was just kind of an idea that was fully baked in the 16th century that just kind of marched outward from Europe until it encompassed the whole world. The historical record is far more varied, and I'm going to make that claim in a minute. But in order to problematize that, what I look at both here and in my other work are notions where sovereign is unstable, or it's in emergence, or it's in contestation. Some of my previous work was about the border, where one would expect the most obvious exhibition of sovereignty, the in-out decision, which is so crucial. And yet the actual practices of sovereignty means that one can cross a border in Canada that allows one admittance into the United States. And you only have to look at the doctrine of non-refoulement or external migration management to understand how complicated that sovereignty line is. So what I want to do here is I want to set out a couple of experiments where different sovereignties are in superposition over a particular territory. They are tested within a legal system, and then to understand what the outcome is. As I said, this is Bruno Latour, who just passed away a couple of years ago, and he makes the case that our contemporary understanding of modernity was built on a separation between science, which had to do with things and nature, and politics, which had to do with humans. And he sort of articulates that has made certain scientific problems impossible to speak about politics. I think that was grammatically poor. Because of the separation between science as the study of things and political science as the study of people, it makes certain complex problems unsolvable by political science. And I think that his recent work on anthropogenic climate change really demonstrated that vividly, that our contemporary model of sovereignty cannot encompass and cannot engage with climate change. And so what he does is he wants to pick up on the assertion by Hobbes, both of the state of nature and of his epistemology, to argue that it was at this point where politics became unable to engage with things. And as Alex intimated, I think that that's one of the places that I think that new materialism has a great deal of leverage to provide. Now, I don't want to tell just that sort of plain story of sovereignty based on the Risk board game. There are a number of important theorists who have talked about sovereignty in different ways. Like the traditional definition from Schmidt is that sovereign is he who decides the exception, and that the kind of a core essential power of sovereignty is to decide when it will obey its own rules and when it might be just action. Rob Walker, famously in 1991, described sovereignty as a way of ordering the limits of the political imagination by describing differently what kinds of politics are available inside a community and what politics are available between communities. Foucault, makes an argument that state power is not simply a no, is not simply the sovereign no, but there is also a degree of production. That's the post-structuralist part. And then Butler, I think, and Cindy Weber's interpretation of Butler would understand sovereignty to have an aspect of performativity to it. Now, with all generosity, I think that one of the underlying challenges of even these critical modes of sovereignty is that they are in relation to the state. Whether it's the nation state or the state, they're in relation to the state. And so it's states in relation to one another. And so there is not a great deal of analytical room to understand or analytical leverage to understand when states are in conversation with non-states or when states are in conversation with peoples. And so what I want to do here is I want to put forward an Inuit notion of sovereignty, which was described by Rachel Kitsualek as the ability to make things move. This is from the official Canadian Inuktitut English dictionary, but she makes the argument that sovereignty in the Inuit sense is, of course, not about borders. It's not about inside and outside. It's not about the relations of peoples or nations, but rather it is not mastery over a territory, but rather mastery of the self. And a mastery of the self, a duty to self-mastery, which is equaled by a respect for the self-sovereignty of others in a system of perpetuating health. And so you can see that even though both, like the Schmittian notion of sovereignty is based on survival, that the Inuit notion of survival that powers this is kind of radically different. And as Alex intimated, that was one of the arguments that I made in the recent APSR piece, was to say that traditional international relations has been built off of Rousseau's notion of the stag hunt and what the conditions for cooperation of anarchy are. But at the same time that Rousseau is writing that, there is an Inuit walrus hunt where there is cooperation under anarchy, and yet the social conditions of that are radically different. And so rather than mastery over a territory and a population, the Inuit notion of sovereignty is about living in concert with the land. Rather than there being jurisdictional supremacy, there is a notion of conflict avoidance. And so, so there's a reason to, amongst the many varieties of Indigenous thought in Canada and around the world, there is a particular reason to focus on the Inuit, who are the Indigenous peoples of the Canadian Arctic and elsewhere. And that's because the assertion of sovereignty over the Canadian Arctic archipelago only started in 1883. It was entirely undetermined until the early 20th century. And there were no laws and regulation passed around about the Arctic until 1914. The entire Northwest Territories, the entire Arctic, was governed by a dozen police for thousands upon thousands of square kilometers. And so, particularly in the moment that we're talking about in the sort of 20s and 30s, there's a lot of active engagement by international actors. The Americans are looking for minerals, the Danes are doing exploring, the Norwegians are doing exploring. And so the Canadians have this nominal security, nominal sovereignty, and yet do not have any tools to impose or to demonstrate that sovereignty. And so there's a real moment where this Inuit notion of sovereignty and the Canadian notion of sovereignty are living, I think, in superposition. They are both available at the same time. And so, so we see a number of attempts by the Canadian state to kind of impose order. So one, which happened a bit later than our cases, but is still really relevant, is the Eskimo disc number system, where Indigenous Inuit were given discs with a number and a letter rather than their name, so that the Canadian state could connect church files, school files, Hudson's Bay files, and police files. And so those are the four arms of kind of Canadian colonialism in the North at the time. And this kind of biopolitical tagging of Inuit was an attempt of the state to know the population. And as R.A.J. Phillips says explicitly, the Canadian state should view the Indigenous Inuit as an experiment, as a laboratory experiment to try and understand what is possible. Because there's no, there are very few permanent settlements, the Canadian state engages with a sovereignty patrol that happens once a year, that goes up, tries to find the Northwest Passage, and comes down again. And so I've made an argument earlier that, just to go back to Foucault for a second, in security, territory, and population, I think before I read that, I understood Foucault to be saying that those three modes of governance were in series, that first came security, then came discipline, then came biopolitics, then came sovereignty. And, it was only in reading STP that you get the sense that, no, these might all happen at the same time. And what's fascinating to me is that in the Arctic, in this period, you really see the Canadian state throwing everything it can at the Arctic in order to demonstrate its sovereignty, both to others and to themselves. And so here I want to get to Agamben, and sort of use Agamben's framework of the state of exception and the Homer soccer as a kind of real experiment, as a test case. Agamben, building on Schmidt, says that the key question of sovereignty is who can be killed by whom, with what political import. And he makes the case for the Homer soccer, that there are some who live in bare life who can be killed but not murdered. And this is particularly important both for the Canadian state and for the Inuit, because the application of the law of murder is understood by the Canadian state as an important way to promulgate the notion of the king, the sovereignty, and the dominion of law. So within Inuit society at that time, there were definitely understandings, there were definitely interpersonal killings, there was definitely intergroup warfare, but those were understood to be individual acts that were settled by individuals. There was no sense that a murder was a sin or a breach against the whole group. And in fact, as we'll see in a minute, the values of collective survival and conflict avoidance were so embedded in Inuit culture at that time that there was a notion that if an individual was acting insane, is the word that it's translated in, but acting in a way that's unpredictable or against the group or endangering the group, then the group would come to a consensus, someone would be delegated, and that person would murder the offending party, and everybody would understand that that was for a group good. And so there's a really different sort of sense of law, of justice, and of murder. And so, here the Canadian state tries to kind of really assert itself as the only thing the only institution that can kill. So the king of the land commands you, saying, "Thou shalt do no murder." Why does he speak that? Long ago, our God made the world and he owns the world. The people also he made and he owns them. The king of the land is commanded by God to protect the people well. The white people and Indians and Eskimos have him for their ruler. He is their ruler. Therefore, he commands, saying, thou shalt do no murder. But if a man kills a man, the king sends his servants, the police, to take and kill the murderer. Like that's going to come in important later, because, you know, in the two murders that we talk about, the police come and they don't kill people right away, but that's what the Inuit think is going to happen. But you don't kill the murderer, nor cause him to be killed. This is only the king's servants, the police, ought to do. But when a man commits murder, at once tell the king's servants, the police, they will take him, bind the murderer, and the ruler will judge him. Thus our God commands, so that you are to follow the king's command. Such a great, rich text, right? Like there's no subtext. It's that thing above the text. It's all political theology. It's all right there. It's all right there for us. And so what's fascinating is the way that Inuit read this document, because in part they read it as a threat that if they engage in the killing that is normal to them, then they will be then they will be killed themselves. And so there's also Rachel Kitsualik, who writes about sovereignty from the Inuit perspective, says that one of the fascinating things about contemporary discourses about sovereignty is that they do not acknowledge the political theological foundations of that Western version of sovereignty. And so to me, it is fascinating how quickly this notion of sovereignty has become secularized within a lifetime in the Arctic. So just to again sort of set the scene, I understand that in the Arctic at this time there is a superposition of law. There are two legal systems that obtain on the same territory. For the Inuit, there is a notion of collective survival over individual sanity. There is a culture of conflict avoidance. You know, the one of the ways that groups and individuals engaged in conflict resolution is by these kind of singing contests, where the person who wins is the one who makes the wittiest joke about the other. And so, you know, like there's something really interesting about that notion of one-on-one combat. There is a culture that is sort of really inculcated with conflict avoidance and the creation of balance. And so there, well, anyway, I can talk about that later. You know, and Kalunat is the Inuit word for European. It means bushy eyebrows. I say this as a kind of this epistemological move so that we don't keep referring to the West as the normal and the Inuit as the different, but sort of, you know, to play with that. And so, you know, like the Kalunat notion of law that is trying to be applied in this space at the same time is one about rights. It's about adversarial justice under a court of law and mastery over the natural world. So I'm going to talk about the first two murder trials of Inuit in Canada. So this is Sinisiak and Uluksuk. So the Catholics and the Anglicans were racing one another in the Arctic for the conversion of souls. Because of Inuit cosmology, they were very open to the idea of another god, another spirit, and Inuit cosmology does not seem to refer a great deal to the afterlife. And so Inuit at the time understood this version of Christianity to be an en plus, like a value added. Here it was giving them information about the cosmos that was in surplus to what they had and didn't necessarily contradict anything they had at the moment. And so there's an interesting story to be told about this. Anyway, so the Anglicans are going up north. The French Catholics then send out these two missionaries to convert folks in the north of Canada, so almost due north of Edmonton towards the Arctic Circle. these two, Rouvier and Leroux, are unequipped. They don't have any survival skills. They can't hunt. They don't have a lot of good stuff, and they don't speak the language. And so they are really incredibly vulnerable. And because of that focus, that Inuit focus on survival and the sort of the importance of the group, the Inuit that they engage with don't understand how the incompetence of the priests is not already a sign that they are irrational, that they are not a danger to the group. So at some point, they are near the Arctic Ocean. There is a dispute about a gun. Someone sort of Cormac, another Inuit, sort of takes away the gun from Rouvier and says, "You don't even know what you're doing. I'm gonna take it." They take the guns, they flee into the storm. They don't have tents, they don't have food, and the next nearest cabin is 200 kilometers away. So Uluksuk and Sinisiak follow them. The priests kind of start to make an agreement with them, but then end up kind of threatening them, and they kill the priests. We know this because Uluksuk and Sinisiak are arrested and disclose everything freely and tell the truth 100% about what they were feeling and why they did what they did. And there's a really fascinating Inuit thinker, Martha Flaherty, who points to this very moment as a kind of epistemological break in Inuit society, because she says up to that point, the obligation to tell the truth was understood as a survival value, that that telling the truth was the only option because everyone needed to have good information in order to survive in the Arctic. And she said when the Westerners came and said, "Now you better tell the truth, don't tell any lies," they all looked around and said, "Oh, we can not tell the truth. That's really interesting." And there's this kind of real rupture in the culture at the moment when the duty to tell the truth and the duty to survive are broken. Anyway, so the crime is discovered in 2014. It takes them until 2016 to be arrested. They freely admit the actions. They understand it as regrettable, but they also understand it as rational. At the first trial, Sinisiak is found not guilty. Everybody on the jury sort of said that there were extenuating circumstances, so he's not guilty. And he says, no, that's not true. I killed him, which is kind of a fascinating, again, like, that will to truth. And so what the judge does is they relocate away from Winnipeg and move it to Calgary, try both of them. They add another charge, they add another victim, and then the judge tells the jury what to find. Says, look, these Inuit, you've got to treat them as children, they're not civilized, but they've admitted it. So there's only one thing that you can say, which is that they're guilty. And since the law says the only penalty for guilt of murder is the death sentence, then we've got to apply the death sentence. But I know that you think that they don't deserve it. I don't think they deserve it. So you're going to come back with a verdict of guilty, which will require me to pass the death sentence. But I'm immediately going to ask for permission to commute the sentence. And so in the court documents, the prosecutors say, it's not so much this crime and these individuals, but rather this verdict is a sign that Canadian law is dominant over the Inuit peoples and the Inuit territory. So the jury comes back with the verdict that the judge tells them to come back with. They are condemned to death. Within 3 days, that is commuted to life imprisonment. They're sent to a fort that doesn't have a prison, so they're just there helping out. After 2 or 3 years, the RCMP want to extend their mandate, so they ask for their help to build another fort further in the wilderness. And after 3 years, they get released back to their home community. And so there's a way in which this, sort of like a very performative sense, this very performative version of justice is really dissipated by the empirics. The judicial system is compromised, the punishment isn't set out, and when Uluksuk and Sinisiniak go back to their home communities, they understand what has happened, but it does not lead them to think that the Western law adheres to the Arctic. So, what I think we find here in this experimental result is that that there is a resolution of the open question about which law is dominant, but the interpretation of it is still extremely loose. And so we get to then the next trial, which happens a couple of years later. So there is a hunter trapper, Robert James, who goes up to the north. He gets, he's not a nice person. He continues to threaten people within his group and without. He gets abandoned by the other Westerners, and he falls in with a group of hunters who are by Navy Board and Arctic Bay. He demands that the group give him all of the seals that they have captured, give him some dogs and some sleds so that he can go back home. They say, no, we need this for survival. And then, and again, in this kind of conflict avoidant way, they take away his guns and then go out hunting for a couple of days. So they don't engage in punishment, they just kind of take away his means of threatening them. But when they come back, he kind of goes crazy and threatens to kill all the dogs, kill all the people. And so the group meets, they all agree that Nikolak is going to shoot James. He does. And then again, in this sort of like interesting way, they keep all of his stuff. They they sort of do a careful tally of what's his and what's not his. And when the constable comes to ask questions, they tell them the story exactly what happens, to say, this is, this is what happened. This is why we did it. So again, 3 years later, that boat that I showed you, the Eastern Arctic Patrol, comes to Pond Inlet, or Metametallic, in Inuktitut, to conduct the trial. This trial is fascinating and amazing, in part because there's one magistrate who's in sort of like full British, a wig and the robes. There's 4 RCMP officers in their bright crimson, and then there's 40 Inuit who are in this trial. The judge doesn't speak Inuktitut. He only speaks French. The RCMP only speak English, and so the translation is going sort of back and forth. And it's clear that no one in the room has the same understanding, has a shared understanding of what's happening. So the Inuit in the room think that if Nikolak is found guilty, then all of the Inuit are going to be murdered. That, that the 4 RCMP officers are there to kill everyone. And at one crucial point in the proceedings, beluga whales start cresting outside. And beluga whales are a delicacy to the Inuit. They provide a really important source of vitamin C, and so that is an absolute hunting priority. So in the middle of these trials, all of a sudden, all the Inuit get up, get their guns, and start running outside. And so the RCMP panic because they think that this is the end of the world, and then they all go off to hunt beluga, and it all goes well. So Nikolak gets sentenced to 10 years in prison in Manitoba, again, in an effort to demonstrate that Canadian laws adhered everywhere in the Arctic. But again, in a fascinating kind of lack of communication, Nikolak does not understand this is the punishment, because they say, we're going to take you down south where we're going to feed you, clothe you, put you in a warm place, and you won't have to hunt or do chores. And so he does not understand that to be a punishment at all. In contrast to his daily life, he thinks this is great. Now, like again, there is this real sense of imposing the law, finding guilt for murder in order to, have the Canadian version of sovereignty dominate over the Inuit people. So here, I think that you see a shifting of the experimental results. In the first one, there was a clear judgment, but it was, but the Inuit didn't understand it to be a punishment. And here, I think that we have the same kind of uncertainty where there is a legal verdict, but the practical action that relates to that legal verdict is not understood by the peoples. And so I think that one of the, I think that my presumption going into this was that the experiment would lead to a clear result. That, that when these two sovereignties clashed, there would be a particular resolution and this state of superposition would collapse into one, that this would sort of come to be understood by everybody as the assertion of Canadian sovereignty. But in fact, neither group understand it to be a resolution of the question. And it really isn't until the Canadian state starts to expand its engagement and put police permanently in different communities that the Canadian notion of law comes to be enforced. Can I just tell you this very funny thing? So the Eastern Arctic Patrol goes up, Baffin Island, goes through the islands, once a year. They try to impose this numbering system by making all Inuit wear discs. And so what the Inuit do, some take the number and are engaged, and others just disappear into the wilderness. And so there's this fantastic sort of sly civility. There's this very interesting resilience by disappearing. Now, the other thing that I think is fascinating and complicates this story, and the reason why, as I said, I want to focus on the Inuit, is because that the Inuit do not understand themselves to have a separate nation with the ambition of a sovereign state, but rather Inuit understand themselves as Canadians. But in any number of political and legal actions, they argue that Canada has relied on Inuit for their assertion of sovereignty in the Arctic, but that is not recognized. And so I think that this kind of, I think that there's something really interesting in the messiness of Canadian sovereignty. Okay. Now, to round out the conversation, what I would like to demonstrate is that is not simply something that happened in the 1920s, but rather it is something that is happening right now, right in this moment. Not only because colonialism is not in the past, but rather is current and ongoing, but also because contemporary Inuit politicians are engaged in discussions about sovereignty with Canada and with international partners. And here I want to point to the Circumpolar Inuit Declaration of Sovereignty in the Arctic. First of all, this is clearly informed by discussions in international relations. Like this could be out of Rosenau and Zempiel from, like 1993. Sovereignties overlap and are frequently divided within federations in creative ways. For Inuit, blah, blah, blah. Like they are clearly engaged in the conversation of sovereignty. But here's what I think is so fascinating, which is that the Inuit claim engagement over sovereignty based not simply on their citizenship, but also on their rights as Indigenous peoples under UNDRIP, under the UN Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and as the historical inhabitants of the Arctic, and as the stewards. And so one of the things that, like the thread that I see connecting this, and one of the ways that I hope that I'm avoiding a recolonization of Inuit thought on sovereignty, is that Inuit today are engaged in an active conversation about what sovereignty might mean. So just by way of a conclusion, I think I've got a minute left, that I think that quantum IR, and in particular this notion of superposition and entanglement, really gets us a way out of both Newtonian and colonial frameworks, in part because I think that the colonial framework is a Newtonian framework. I think that those two are connected. And secondly, I think that this notion of entanglement, superposition, and multiplicity is really not only a ethical, but is empirically a much better way of understanding sovereignty in all of its forms. And I think that what I hope to have done is to engage in Indigenous thought about sovereignty without simply extracting, the Inuit notion of the ability to make things move, but rather demonstrate the way in which those conversations about sovereignty continue to be kind of entangled and mutually beneficial. Anyway, I'll stop there. Thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
All right, thank you, Mark. I've got a question, but there's one question in the queue, so let's start there, and then I'll ask mine if no one else is in the queue. This is from Shmuel. Question for Mark. Is it according to you, all cases of sovereignty must include full national and political independence?
Well, thanks. I think no, not at all. And I think that that's the important addition I want to make. There were a number of theorists right out, like in the era of globalization, like Castells or Sasson, who talked about the unbundling of the capacities of the state, right? So Sasson famously said territory, authority, and rights, they used to be bundled together in the sovereign state, but now we see them being dispersed amongst different kind of supra and sub-national entities. However, what I think is really interesting and important when looking at decolonizing international relations is that, particularly in Canada, in relation to Indigenous thinkers, there is a really close tie to national political independence. So Audra Smith's Mohawkus Interruptus, or Taiyaki Alfred on sovereignty, or Glenn Coulthard, Redskins, White Masks. A lot of those Indigenous authors talk about the sovereign state and talk about national political independence as the goal. And I think that what's really interesting about the Inuit case in Canada right now is that they are interested in questions of authority and self-determination, but their end state, their end desired state, is not independence, is not political independence, but rather recognition of Inuit as full citizens of Canada. And so I think that I think that case is critical for a number of reasons.
That actually relates very smoothly to my question, which is, I mean, over time, if you look at the trajectory of interaction between the Canadian state and the Inuit, for example, the Canadian state is trying to impose this more Newtonian conception of sovereignty. And over time, you would think that they're going to succeed because they can socialize the Inuit to sort of say, this is the modern way to do things. So do we actually see, or is that, I mean, setting aside the normative aspect of that, do we actually see such a convergence on this Newtonian view, or is it still it's not as contested as it used to be, it sounds like, but I guess I'd like to hear more about this, whether the Newtonian view is going to, in the end, dominate.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I hadn't thought about that. I hadn't thought about that in that way before. I think that, the Nunavut Land Claims Agreement is different from other settlements with the between Indigenous peoples in the Canadian state, because the question of membership in the Land Claims Agreement is not solely based on ethnicity and sort of blood quanta, where it sometimes is in the Mohawk Nation or the Anishinaabe Nation. And so there's something that is different about those different about the membership, like, so for so for Mohawk peoples and Algonquin peoples in Canada, one of the ways that the Canadian state tried to both deracinate and control the Indigenous populations was by governing who might have status as an Indian. And so status, which would previously been matrilinear in Indigenous societies, was reappropriated by the Canadian state as being patrilinear. And so women who married outside of the tribe lost their Indigenous status. And so there is this resurgent focus on genealogy and membership in those tribes in order to get to a post-reconciliation state. But that's not the way that the Inuit understand it. The other thing that I would say is that the Eskimo so, like Inuit naming traditions are different than sort of Western naming traditions. And so, like just in a Newtonian sense, my name is Mark, and it's Mark no matter where I go, no matter who I speak to. Like I might be dad to somebody, but like it's Mark, like even my kids know that I'm Mark. Whereas in Inuit families, one is known by different names by different people. And so, because because Inuit peoples understand the soul to kind of be persistent and migratory, people change their name over time, and they have the named relationship, not just the biological relationship. And so, Alex, if you, so I might know you as Alex, but my child might know you as sister because their sister's name was Alex and they died. You took on the name Alex. And so they would see you both as a woman and as their sister. And so they would refer to you as sister. And so even though the Canadian state has a birth certificate and has a really strict naming system, that does not change the facts on the ground, that people still have this very different notion of identity. Same thing with the food program. Like food prices in the North are bananas. It's a bad metaphor. Are insane because of the transportation costs. There's no farming up there, etc. So, like a head of lettuce in Pond Inlet is routinely $50. Like they get dry goods once a year when they're shipped up from a cargo ship from Montreal. And so the Canadian government is constantly intervening in the market to try and make a market salary wage economy work in the North, because it is unsurvivable on sort of the salary or the benefits that would naturally occur there. So the Canadian state is always dumping money into airlines or food providers in order to do that. And so the Inuit, understanding this, frequently they have a mixed economy. There's a lot of subsistence farming and hunting, a lot of subsistence hunting and fishing that happens, that then kind of supplements the diet. And kind of messes with the wage economy in ways that are really super interesting. There's a great film that I would urge everyone to watch called Angry Inuk, which is about the EU banning seal products, but managed to touch on all of those things.
Okay, we've got a few people in the queue, but Michael has his hand raised, which was first. So let's go to Michael, and then we'll go back to the queue.
Yeah, hi, Mark. Thanks for this fascinating talk. So what struck me when I was listening to the stories is that in a sense, like the level of honesty the Inuits have and displayed and continue to display apparently, and as if, and in a sense, this kept them safe. Because they were, I mean,
Yeah.
they agreed, and so
Yeah.
and I wonder whether first, like, several questions, whether in a sense this urge or this premise to lie is a Western thing, and whether, and also what I see is that you were talking about superpositions of mentalities, and but what I would also, one could also see it this way, that the Inuits have a much better appreciation for contextuality and are more fluid. So in a sense, they are already more quantum-like.
Yeah.
And whether this comes with this transparency and will for honesty, and whether we can learn from them actually. Yeah, I don't know. All of this ideas. This is what I wanted to comment on.
Thank you. Yes, you know, I think that the like an Inuit cosmology understands nature to be in relation to the people, and that the goal of survival is not simply about the survival of humans, but rather the survival of the entire system, which I think is really different. I think that that's why, to me, there's something interesting in looking at anarchy within the from an Inuit point of view, because descriptions of climate change and the Anthropocene all kind of predict this Malthusian, you know, kind of race to the bottom, you know, like the Nigel Farage version of climate change policy, which says, you know, I'm not going to do anything until China fixes its problem, you know, and Latour tries to engage with this also. And Inuit do not understand themselves to be disconnected from nature, from the climate, from land, but rather in relation to it. And so I think that there's really something interesting in that engagement. The will to truth thing, I think, is so fascinating, because it is both a will to truth that is connected to survival, but it is also about an absence of conflict. And so when I think about, you know, like, it's an illustration of what I understand to be my common sense, right? If I think, you know, like, I'm British, right? So I don't think that telling the truth is a good way to be polite in the best of circumstances, right? Like, I think we should always be indirect so as not to hurt anyone's feelings, because telling the truth is an inherently conflictual mode of being. But that's not at all how the Inuit, you know, like how the Inuit see it in that moment. And so I think there's something super interesting there. I do think that there is a natural openness within Inuit culture. And also, I want to be reminded of what Zoe Todd says, which is, you know, a critique that she levels against Latour, saying the problem with, you know, like, old white guys is they go and they discover an indigenous concept and then pretend that it's theirs, and don't pay attention to the rest of the context that that idea comes from. And so that's part of the reason why my intellectual production has been so slow over the past few years, as I tried to really build up my competence in that holistic picture.
Thank you.
Okay, so going to the queue, Michael Murphy, who you know well, asks, I was wondering if you could expand on the connection between political theology and the Newtonian foundation of colonial sovereignty. This came to mind when you discussed the Declaration. The same early modern European theology that informed Hobbes's writings on sovereignty also informed Newton's explanation of the balance of celestial bodies that directly informed balance of power concepts.
Yeah, well, I can't expand on that more than Michael can. Like, Michael should answer this question. But I think that when I first look at, when I did a reading course on Hobbes' Leviathan with a philosopher, and my impulse was to skip through the first 6 chapters to get to the good bit where he talks about the state of nature. And the philosopher was like, no, the good bit is right at the beginning where he talks about sensations coming in the eyes and then connecting to the brain, which creates thoughts. He says that's the crucial part. And I think that since then, I've been really interested in the deep connections between this kind of epistemology and political thought. When we look at descriptions of anarchy, state of nature, they are all written in relation to the impression of indigenous cultures. Like Hobbes is operating in a world in which he understands the state of nature to be the world of indigenous people in North America. And so when he says this is what happens in nature, to him, it's not an abstract question. There's an empirical kind of example that drives that, which is indigenous peoples of North America. And so I think that we cannot separate out the notion, that work by Todorov on Conquest of America about the kind of the imbrications of coloniality and that political theology at the time. But again, I defer to Michael on all questions of political theology.
Okay, Matthew asks, very interesting presentation, Mark. Regarding conflict, is there evidence that the indigenous way of sovereignty and survival with respect to conflict resolution has evolved over time from the singing joke contests to something like constructive, respectful, mutual understanding practices? Not like judicial adversarial, but at the same time evolving toward introduction of developing wise practices of loving and respecting. It seems that they may have a much higher probability of great insight and breakthrough compared to Western ways of power, persuasion, ego, and violence.
That's such a fascinating question. I'm just rereading Paul Okerlik, Zebedee Nungak, and then Peter Itanuar. The Canadian state, in all of its wisdom, took these 3 young Inuk men and brought them down to Ottawa to see if they could be educated like white people. And so kind of took them out of their homes in the north and put them in foster homes in Ottawa, and just kind of brought them up in the English educational system. And within 10 years, they are forming demands for political independence for the Inuit. It is fascinating the way to which that educational key unlocked a different kind of political engagement. Because I think, and it was not at all one that was more loving and respectful or, sort of gentle. They learned how to engage in adversarial politics by being educated here in the South and feeling the racism that they did not understand, that they understood to be natural up north and was unnatural here. And so, Inuit politics are ever evolving, and there are the ITK, Inuit Taput Kamatari, which is the National Association for Inuit People, has been engaged very powerfully with the Canadian government on its new northern strategy. And they have learned through courts, policy, and public opinion how to engage with the Canadian state, but they do it on the Canadian state's terms.
That's interesting because I don't know if you're familiar with Nora Bowman's work.
Yeah.
Okay, because her whole thing is about the First Nations versus the Canadian state and the bargaining that's happening there. And this kind of ties back to Michael's comment, which was kind of offhand about the Inuit maybe are already more quantum-like than Westerners. And that's sort of Nora Bowman's argument too, is that, you know, these First Nations are kind of quantum in their worldview.
Yeah.
So she's not telling a story about learning to fight on the Western terms. She's telling a story about fighting on quantum terms in a sense.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm wondering, I mean, do you see the Inuit as embodying a more quantum ontology and epistemology? And is that a relevant consideration in this discussion, or is that kind of just too far abstract?
No, I think I 100% do. And I take this, the naming practice as one of those key senses of not being, not only not individualistic, but that everyone's identity is always already in relation. And it's always already in relation, not only to others, but in to a past as well. Because the name that you inherit the familial relations of that name. So even the base sense of identity is itself relational and entangled in a way that I think opens, you know, like there's a natural openness to fluidity and causality in ways that are, you know, like are quantum, are different from us.
Actually, one of my slogans when I'm talking to undergraduates, especially about what is the bottom line of quantum, is you know, who we are depends on who we're with. And in a sense, that's exactly what you just described, is that it's a complete change of identity, and that could even have relation to naming practices and everything else. And okay, well, let's see. Heather Mahardy, Mark, I saw a stat from the World Bank that 80% of global remaining biodiversity is safeguarded in indigenous lands. Yet I see waves of data on how these same communities are hit first by imperialistic climate change. How do you see QIR moving the dial?
Oh, that's such a great question. You know, well, there is a project called ARCVIC Students on Ice, in which Indigenous elders and youth are being trained to do wildlife sampling, environmental observation, to create, you know, to become not only the objects of Western science, but rather to participate in the generation of knowledge and in the analysis of climate change. And so I think that more and more we're going to see the replication of that kind of model, where there is a validation of Indigenous ways of knowing, but not in a condescending way. So there's an app that they have developed called Siku. I'm just going. I'm going to put it. I'm going to put it in the chat. And what it is an app by Indigenous people for Indigenous people to map out things like ice conditions, hunting grounds, to help with search and rescue, to marshal weather data. And it is, and it's sort of Indigenous owned and Indigenous and sort of like is about engaging in knowledge mobilization of Indigenous knowledge in modern and contemporary ways. And so I think that that's, you know, like I think that we're going to see more and more translations of those kinds of projects.
Okay. Jakub has got his hand up, so I think you're next.
Thank you for a fascinating talk, Mark. I just wanted to elaborate on this last point because it has been raised during the bootcamp several times. Because if I understood your thinking about those experiments correctly, I think that you talk about you know, Canadian state, settler colonial and versus Inuit as kind of you know, in competition, whereas Nora Bowman and also, for example, Liam Hubbard yesterday talk about basically complementarity of the classical versus quantum view, that we consider consider them complement each other. And he was referring to basically, inside of economy, classical versus quantum, like he equated to a behavioral economy. And I wonder whether you see this as complementary as well, and how does, for example, with this scientific knowledge or empirical knowledge regarding environmental degradation, how this complementary they could look like if like implemented.
Yeah. I think that there's every possibility for complementarity, but there has to be more engagement by Western dominant institutions to be open to that. And one of the, like, if I can just speak about here, I'm at the Faculty of Social Science at the University of Ottawa. The University of Ottawa as an institution is attempting to engage in a process of decolonization and reconciliation. And one of the ways that we have done that is by hiring a Indigenous curriculum specialist who we can talk to provide complementary readings or material that can possibly, that can add to, Waltz, and Rousseau. And one of the challenges that we have is that the mandate for the dean associated to reconciliation is 2 years. And so our Indigenous curriculum specialist says, well, like, my relationship is with people, it's not with an office. And so when you reset the person every 2 years, to me, that resets the work of reconciliation, because I have to start all over again. And so even though there's this willingness to be complementary, and to say we can add Indigenous knowledge, the Indigenous knowledge keepers have a different way of understanding their relation to the institution. And that is not about a relationship to an office holder, but it's not a relationship of the office, it's a personal relationship with the office holder. And so I think that the burden of decolonization has to fall equally on the colonizer as it does on the colonized, right? And that there have to be some radical openness to change in the ways that we not just think, but the ways that we do business in order to really engage in that reconciliation. And I think that until that works, then there's, there's little hope. There's in this film, Angry Inuk, it's about the EU ban on seal products, on seal fur. And there is this fantastic and interesting conflict at the EU, where the Inuit go and they say, we want to be able to, kill seals in order to sell seal fur. And the EU says, yeah, you can do it because you're Indigenous people for subsistence reasons or for kind of cultural reasons. And the Inuit say, no, we don't care about that. We want the money. We need the money. We want to sell things. We want to be in the market. And they say, yeah, well, that's not going to happen because it's disgusting. But if you want to do it for yourselves, then you can do it for yourselves. Like, that to me is like one of those interesting moments where there's a real attempt to kind of like keep Indigenous peoples in their own sort of, little, like in their own space like that.
Okay. Oh, we got another question, I think. Yes, Zhrinka. So thank you for the inspiring presentation. How do you see the possibility for knowledge convergence between universalistic bases in science and Indigenous education in public schools? The UN and the UNESCO support that convergence for the sake of solving the climate problem. Knowing that the Indigenous people have to adjust to law and education system to survive, it might be problematic.
This is such a, I'm really wrestling with this question at the moment. Because there might be a tendency to valorize the persistence of Indigenous peoples and their resilience in the face of climate change and of colonialism, and to say, like, well, we've oppressed them for 200 years, but look, they're really doing great. So, like what of their beliefs can we reappropriate in order to help ourselves? And, like Bruno Latour had an interview near the end of his life in which he said something very similar, where he said, well, the indigenous peoples of Alaska are way more resilient than Sarah Palin, because Sarah Palin lost one election and now she's in a disaster. But those indigenous people, they've lasted through 300 years of colonization and they're still going strong. So that's super dangerous, and I don't want to do that. And at the same time, I do think that there's something really to learn from that resilience under such an epistemological and ontological threat. The approach that has been, I have a daughter who's Inuit. That's part of the reason sort of that that led me down to this path. And so I've seen 3 different ways that schools have tried to engage in Indigenous politics. The first was that a teacher had a debate for and against colonialism. So the students had to role play being either the colonizer or the indigenous peoples. And so the colonizers had the script, well, we've got all of these technology, and the indigenous kids had the script, well, you all smell bad because you don't have personal hygiene. And that was meant to be some kind of like equivalent, and they would gain empathy. So that's not good. That's terrible. The second tactic that I've seen is that they separate out the indigenous kids, and they sort of try to create bonds amongst the indigenous kids themselves, no matter where the indigenous kids comes from, whether they're from the West Coast Salish Nation, the Mohawk, the Innu in Quebec, the Inuit in Nunavut. Like, they all just put all the indigenous kids to try and create this identity of indigenous versus the non-indigenous kids. That doesn't work either. The closest that I've seen be successful has been, ironically, the Montessori method, where the Montessori method of kind of like self-teaching action, learning through doing, learning through peer support, closely mirrors Indigenous ways of thinking and teaching. And so there's a strange way in which, even though there is not a lot of Indigenous content in Montessori, the mode of engagement of the Montessori method is similar to Indigenous ways of teaching. And so, like, I mean, I think strangely to me, that is that's a real, that's been weirdly the most productive.
Okay, so I have another question, but I want to, but rather go to someone in the audience if there's anybody who wants to, but there's no one in the queue right now. All right, well then I'll ask my question. And I guess it's a bit of a change in focus. I'm interested in kind of the sociology of knowledge of this sort of quantum IR. And especially given your background, I guess I'm interested in how you think about the fact that there's so much resistance to quantum thinking, even among people that I would think would be very much on the same page, really, in terms of their ontology and epistemology and so on. So what is and then on the other hand, some new materialists have jumped on board and others are saying, no, this is heresy and so on. So I'm interested in your kind of take on that, because as the editor of Security Dialogue, you probably see this all the time in different configurations. So what could you say about the sociological problem, in a way, so to speak, of QIR?
In 2003, I got interviewed at Carleton University for a job. And they said, Mark, the problem with you postmoderns, because if you remember, Alex, back in the day, those were the options: realist, liberal, feminist, or postmodern. They said, the problem with you postmoderns is that you just kind of tell a story and then that's it. And I said, oh no, it's the opposite. I have to defend the whole project of postmodernism, post-structuralism, and critical thought first, and then go on to tell my story. And so like it's not easier. I've actually got to defend the whole intellectual project before I make any headway on my own specific case. And I feel that that's the mode that we're in with quantum IR right now, is that the language and the approach seems so different that there is this inherent reluctance, because the math is hard and because some of the concepts are non-intuitive, just as postmodernism is. Like that's that's not there's no great structural difference, but I think that because the quantum community is relatively small, I think that we have to defend the project first and then make the argument second. When I gave, one of the first presentations that I gave was to your students at Ohio State, and I remember them saying, "Well, this is all very interesting, but I can do everything that you can do without any of the quantum stuff. So what do you need this quantum stuff for? What does it do for me?" And I think that my response in the first instance was not as robust, but I think that I'd be stronger now in saying, no, like quantum can do things that the Newtonian stuff just cannot. But even me, who's on board with the project, it took me a while to really develop that answer well, because I think, Alex, the other thing that I recognize or that I've seen in the way that you present to audiences that are curious but not sympathetic, if I can put it that way, is, like I've heard you say, look, to me, the most essential question is the question of consciousness. So like, however we start, that's where we've got to end, and so, like, this is how I'm going to get to quantum conscious and then, go back out. But I think that because there is no consensus amongst the wider QIR crowd, that I'd say this with love, right? Like I say this as an observer, not as a critic, but because I don't think that that is the consensus point within the quantum crowd, that I don't think that there is the same kind of set of answers amongst the quantum folks that there is for like critical security, right? Like critical security is new, but everybody says, how does something become a security issue? And so that kind of question can attract and unify a bunch of folks. But I don't think that, I could be wrong, but it's my sense that quantum does not have that same kind of question.
Yeah, there are so many entry points to quantum and so many different interests that people might have in some of the concepts. I guess the other thing I would say about your response just now is that I think that the non-quantum community, I get that too, that we can do everything that you can do. We don't need quantum to do any of this. But actually, I would say that like you, that's not really true, and that quantum can do things that the classical perspective cannot do. And the real problem is that the non-quantum, or the skeptics, refuse to acknowledge that they're either quantum or Newtonian. They don't want anything to do with any kind of physical worldview. They want to totally detach themselves. It's all about language and everything else. And so then if you deny that you're either, then I don't think makes any sense. But I think that is a very common response. They don't want to play the game, and it's a way not to play the game in a sense. And perhaps that's lets them off the hook. But that's more of an editorial comment.
Yeah, and I think that that's, sort of one of the ways that the new materialists either come in or don't come into the conversation. I remember doing a summer school at PRIO in Oslo about critical security methods, and I sort of started out the first by saying, okay, we can all agree that the politics is everywhere, that agency is prolific, and that causality is emergent rather than efficient. I was like, so we'll start there and then we'll go forward. And everyone's like, whoa. Of course, causality is efficient. Like how can you even say that it's emergent? And like I realized that that some of those quantum concepts had been so embedded in my thinking that I wasn't even starting from the same place as those graduate students were. But I think that from a raw sociological point of view, it's also a question about volume, right? That there aren't enough articles, chapters, books that made it onto comp lists, that make it onto comprehensive exams, that are on the Oxford reading list, like there aren't enough graduate courses, like I think that it's a numbers thing at the moment also, that this seems pretty exotic.
Yeah, and I think part of the numbers problem is, of course, that the technology, the math is very intimidating for even high-tech mainstream social scientists. But what's missing, I think, is a killer app, is the phrase I've heard from somebody, and we don't have that yet. But in time, go ahead.
No, I don't want to bring him into it, but like the without his consent, but like Michael Murphy's paper at this year's ISA, I don't know whether you saw it or if you read a version, but like he makes a super interesting argument. I don't want to speak for him, but my understanding is that he says the math about kind of probabilistic fields predates quantum. And that this is actually that there's another way of thinking about this, which is that it's not just about quantum theory, but it's about the probabilistic math. And that seems to me to be a really interesting way to open the door to different kinds of folks. I think it's a really interesting tactic.
Yeah, well, in the long run, presumably truth will win out. That's sort of so maybe that's a naive kind of positivist assumption, but I think just have to give it enough time. That's all.
Yeah.